have to meet someone who works in the work that Bryan does. And it can happen. You can be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Any of us in this room. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce my big brother, Bryan Allen Stevenson, Equal Justice Executive Director from Montgomery, Alabama.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful honor to be here. This is unlike anything I've done recently. I have to speak after Martin Luther King, and I had to sit there and hold my breath, fearing what my sister might say about me. My sister and I are really close. All of my siblings are very close. If this was just 3 days ago, I could say we're the same age, but as she revealed, I'm a year older, but I had the great privilege of growing up in Delaware. Delaware is still my home. I think of Delaware as not only my birthplace, but my home. And it's wonderful to be back here. It's wonderful to be in this space. There's so many people who I knew as a child growing up in Sussex County who are here. And so for me, this is a really special, special time. And not only do I know Bernice Edwards, but I know her family. Her father and her mother were the adults in my life as a child growing up, and it's just wonderful to be back in this space, and wonderful to be in the space where we're talking about the work of the First State Agency. This is an organization that is dedicated to doing the critically important work to help the people in this state that oftentimes are left out. They are living in the margins of our society, and I want to talk tonight, just very briefly, about how critical it is that we see in their work not only the challenge that faces all of us, but the opportunity to create a better Delaware. And none of us should leave this place tonight thinking that we don't need a better Delaware, because we do. We need a Delaware that is actually even closer than we are to justice, to fairness, to equality, to opportunity. This state and this nation are very different than they were when I was a kid growing up. We were dealing with different challenges then. We're dealing with new challenges now. Today in the United States, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. There are 6 million people on probation and parole in this country. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they apply for a loan or try to get a job, they're going to be disfavored. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 640% in the last 20 years. 70% of these women are single parents with minor children. And that means when they go to prison, their children get displaced. There is this growing despair in poor communities. We have 50 million people now living below the federal poverty level. It's the highest it's been in 50 years. And when you go into poor communities, oftentimes you see not only the structures and the difficulties of housing and hunger and homeless and education and opportunities, but you also see this hopelessness. I sit down with 12 and 13-year-old boys, and when we have honest conversations, some of them tell me that they don't believe they're going to be free by the time they're 21. And they say that not because of something they've seen on TV, they say that because that's what they see happening in their community. There are collateral consequences to over-incarceration in this era of mass imprisonment and excessive punishment. We had the president come to Alabama this past March to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. 80,000 people came. They marched across the bridge, but very few of them knew or appreciated the fact that today in Alabama, 31% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote. The statistic that really breaks my heart is this one from the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century. That was not true in the 19th century. It's become true in the 21st century. The statistic for Latino boys is 1 in 6. There is violence in the streets of Wilmington. There's despair in the streets of Wilmington. There are these gaps and these barriers that have allowed one of our wealthiest states in the nation to nonetheless still be the space where there's lots of poverty and disconnection. I want to talk about 4 things I think we can do through the First State Agency, but through our work as well, to bridge this gap. We can create a more just Delaware. We can create a more healthy, hopeful Delaware. The first thing I want to urge us to do is to get proximate. If we want to see this state become healthier, fairer, more just, we've got to choose to get proximate to the parts of our state where there is despair, where there's poverty, where there's neglect. I believe that you can't actually solve problems from a distance. If you really want to problem solve, you've got to get close enough to the problem to see the details and the nuances of the problem. Proximity will teach you things that you cannot learn from a distance. I'm a product of proximity. I grew up in Sussex County. Many of you know that there was a time in Sussex County when there were no high schools for black kids. My dad is here. When he was a teenager, there wasn't any high schools for black children to attend. I actually started my education at the colored school in Milton, Delaware. When I started my education, they didn't let colored kids go to the public schools. And then lawyers came into the community and made them open up the public schools. Some of you will remember the Milford 10, who tried to integrate the schools in the 1950s and were forced out because there was resistance. And that opportunity was taken away because people were making decisions from a distance. But when they got close, those lawyers and those advocates, those leaders and those clergy, and opened up the schools, they opened up opportunities. But for their choice to get proximate to me and kids like me in Sussex County, I wouldn't be standing here. I got to go to high school. I got to go to college. I loved college. When I was in college, I was very active in music, very active in sports. I was a philosophy major. I'll be honest, when I got to college, it was so wonderful. You could go to the dining hall, they would feed you, you got to do whatever you wanted to do. I said, I'm going to stay in college the rest of my life. And when I was a senior, I would go out on the hillside sometimes and I'd sit down and I'd think what I thought were these great deep thoughts. And somebody came up to me one day and said, you're a senior and you're a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized all of a sudden that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated. And because no one in my family had actually graduated from college, I didn't know what probably all of you knew. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science to get into graduate school. I didn't realize that, so I kept looking, trying to find out how I was going to stay in school. And to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was very clear to me that you don't need to know anything to go to law school. So I signed up for that and found myself at Harvard Law School, and there decided that I'd made a terrible mistake. Because I went to law school because I was interested in doing something about racial inequality and poverty and injustice, and they weren't talking about race. They weren't talking about poverty. They weren't talking about injustice. It's only when I got proximate to condemned people on death row that law made sense to me. All of a sudden, I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground, and that calling radicalized my interest in the law. There is power in proximity. You actually have more power than you think you have. But when you get close to those who have been disadvantaged, those who are vulnerable, those who are poor, those who are marginalized, and you are just proximate, you realize your power. I work on cases involving children. My clients have gotten younger and younger and younger. I did a case several years ago involving a boy who was 14 years of age. He lived in a household where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend, and when this man would start drinking, he would get violent. One day he'd been drinking, he came home, he walked into the kitchen, he called the boy's mother into the kitchen. He didn't say anything, he just walked up to her and he punched her in the face. She hit her head as she fell down, and she was lying on the floor, unconscious. Her son came running into the kitchen. He saw his mother lying there, covered in blood. He tried to get her to respond. She wasn't responsive. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. So this little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man had fallen asleep. He started to go to the telephone to call the police or an ambulance, but instead, he went over to a dresser drawer where he knew this man kept a handgun. He pulled the drawer open and he pulled out the gun. He walked over to where the man was sleeping and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and after a few minutes, the man stopped snoring. And when the man stopped snoring, this little boy tragically pulled the trigger, shot the man in the head. The man died almost instantly. This boy was very small for his age. He was about 5 feet tall. He weighed under 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. No prior juvenile adjudications. He was the kind of child that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days when his grandmother called me to get involved, and I went over to meet the boy, and he walked into the jail, and he sat down, and he looked so sad and small, and I tried to ask him questions, but he wouldn't say anything to the questions I asked. He just kept sitting there. I finally put my pen down and I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. And he wouldn't say a word. I got up and I walked around the table. I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And he just kept staring at the wall. Couldn't figure out what to do. And so at some point, I just leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on him. And when I did, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been raped. On the night before I'd gotten there, he said so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. Eventually, I got him calmed down. I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You just stay right here. And I remember trying to leave, and this little boy grabbing me by the arm, saying, please, please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. I'm going to be right back. You stay right here. And I left that jail, and the question I had in my mind is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We have let too many children in our state, in our nation, go unprotected. We've let the poor and the neglected and the abused be discarded. And a just society, a society committed to its children, has to get close to those kids. That's what First State is trying to do. They're trying to get close to the places where there's difficulty. You've heard it said, if there's bad schools over there, if that's a bad crime neighborhood, if there are problems over there, you stay away. I'm here to argue that we should get closer to the places where there is struggle. We should get closer to the places where there's despair and neglect. We should get closer to the children and the families that are living in the margins of our society. And through proximity, I believe we can make a difference. And I also believe that we can find our strength and our character. Second thing I want to urge you to do. It's not enough to get proximate. We actually have to change narratives. The problem of mass incarceration in this country isn't just about making a bad decision to deal with drug dependency and drug addiction as a crime issue rather than a health issue, creating all of these mandatory sentences. The real problem is this narrative of fear and anger that emerged in our nation. We had politicians competing with each other over who can be the toughest on crime. And for 40 years, nobody was willing to talk about rehabilitation or recovery or restoration. It was too soft, too weak. And this narrative allowed us to create a system where even in this state, we lowered the minimum age and put children as young as 13 and 14 years of age in prison, sentenced some to die in prison. We embraced the death penalty. We embraced these excessive schemes, and we did it because we were afraid and angry. And I will tell you that you do not make good decisions when you're rooted in fear and anger. If you're going to be a just society, you have to step back from that. You look all around the world and you see bad policies, bad decisions that are rooted in fear and anger, and we have to change that narrative. I think we have to change the narrative about race in this country. We are still in this nation burdened by our history of racial inequality. I believe all of us are infected. We've been dealing with this narrative of racial difference that's emerged that we haven't confronted. And because we haven't confronted it, it still manifests itself. It doesn't take very much for us to have conflicts and issues and difficulties that revolve around this question of race. So I think we have to change the narrative. We have to talk about some things I know we don't want to talk about, but we're going to have to talk about them to get to the other side. I think we have to talk about things like slavery. You see, I think slavery has created a legacy that still haunts us. Delaware was a slave state. And the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude. It wasn't forced labor. It was the ideology that we created of white supremacy. We made up this notion that black and white people are different. We said black people are not like white people. They're not smart, they're not hardworking, they're not this, they're not that. And because of that, we actually legitimated slavery. And you know, there was slavery all over the world, but it was different in America where we created this slave society. And when we passed the 13th Amendment in 1865, we didn't talk about the narrative of racial difference. We only talked about involuntary servitude. We only talked about forced labor. When the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, we didn't talk about that. Delaware was actually resistant. Delaware had been promised that they could keep their slaves. And so we didn't ratify the 13th Amendment in this state until 1901. 35 years after its passage, there was resistance. And I don't believe that slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and lynching and violence. We traumatized people of color for a very long time.
Older people come up to me, they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. There were times when you couldn't be in the circle in Georgetown, Delaware. There were times when we weren't supposed to be on the streets of Wilmington, Delaware, where there were conflict and strife. These realities shifted. The demographic geography of this country was shaped by terrorism. We've got black people in New York and Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit, Los Angeles and Oakland, and they did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror. And we never dealt with that trauma. And so we have to change that narrative. Even when we talk about civil rights, I'll be honest, I get worried. I think we're a little too celebratory. We love talking about the civil rights movement, and it's wonderful that we do, but I worry that it's become too much like a carnival. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it sounds like a 3-day event. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington, and on day 3, we just changed all the laws. And it would be great if that's our history, but that's not our history. Our history is that for decades, we humiliated people of color. We did. People in this state who had to see the signs, white and colored, we humiliated them, and we created burdens and batters and difficulties that we are still struggling to overcome. So I think we should have committed ourselves to a process of truth and reconciliation in the 1960s, and we didn't do it. And because we didn't do it, there is this presumption of dangerousness and guilt that continues to follow too many black and brown people. And this burden has accumulated itself, and now we have this violence and this resistance. We have these police shootings, and there is this distrust. But on the other side of this, I think there is something that feels more like freedom. You go to South Africa, and you will see that they could not recover from apartheid without truth and reconciliation. Go to Rwanda, and they'll tell you that they won't get past the genocide without truth and reconciliation. Go to Germany. Go to Berlin, Germany. You can't go 100 meters without seeing a marker or a stone that marks the place where a Jewish family was abducted and taken to the concentration camps. The Germans want you to visit the Holocaust camps and reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. We don't talk about these issues that have developed and have haunted us. And I think we have to change that narrative. I believe we can do better. I do. And when we do better, I think we'll feel something that is so much more liberating and exciting than what we felt. I go through Wilmington and I see the legacy of our history. I drive through Dover, I see that legacy, I see it all over the state. I see such great promise and potential, but I see this legacy, and we're going to have to change that narrative. Third thing, it's not enough to be proximate and change narratives. I also believe we have to protect our hope. I grew up surrounded by people who had such hope in me. I'm so moved when I come back. Every time I come home, I see people, and I see all the people who had hope that I might be able to do something. And it breaks my heart when I go into places now when I don't see hope. And I will tell you that your hope is essential. I believe that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And when we become hopeless about what we can do, we become vulnerable to being a part of the problem. You have to believe things you haven't seen. I believe that hope is what gets you to stand up when other people are saying sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people are saying be quiet. And we have to protect our hope. There are some of us who actually have given up on what we can do to create a healthier community, to create more opportunity, to alleviate poverty, and that is what we must get past. It's hard to be hopeful sometimes. The world is complicated, devastated by what's happened in Paris, devastated by some of the ugliness and violence that I see around the world, but I am persuaded that it is the hopeful among us that have the answers to these problems. You know, I grew up around these amazing people, but I also, when I moved to Montgomery, I met some amazing people. I was a lucky young lawyer to be mentored by Rosa Parks. She was an amazing human being. When I moved to Montgomery, there was a woman there named Johnny Carr, who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And when I got to Montgomery, Ms. Carr called me up and she said, now Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to Montgomery. I said, yes I am. She said, well, if you're a young lawyer, I'm going to call you up sometimes and I'm going to ask you to go some places and speak. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to ask you to go some places and listen. And she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. So I said, yes, ma'am. And she did. She'd call me up and she'd send me places to speak. She'd send me places to talk. And one day she called me up and she said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town, and we're going to get together over at Miss Durr's house. Miss Durr was, Virginia Durr was a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. And then Ms. Carr said, do you want to come over and listen, I said, oh, yes, ma'am, I do. And she said, well, come on over. And then she'd ask me sometimes, she'd say, now, what does the word listen mean? That would be my cue to know. I'd have to tell her. I knew I wasn't supposed to say anything. So I went over there, I got next to these women. I met Ms. Parks, and Ms. Carr was there, and Ms. Durr was there, and I listened to these older women talk for almost 2 hours. And the amazing thing was that they weren't talking about what they had done. They were talking about what they were going to do. And there was this hopefulness in the voices and in the hearts of these women that was absolutely mesmerizing. I was so inspired. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, now, Bryan, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And so I gave her my rap. I said, we're trying to do something about excessive punishment. We're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about the racial bias. We're trying to do something about poverty. We're trying to do something about over-incarceration. We're trying to do something about children prosecuted as adults. We're trying to do something about the mentally ill. We're trying to do something about the vulnerable and the disabled. We're trying to do something about conditions of confinement. I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired, tired, tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave. There is nothing more urgent in this state than our willingness to stay hopeful about what we can do. We can do better than we're doing in Wilmington, in the poor, violent sections. We can do better than we're doing in our educational system. We can do better to create opportunities for the poor and the marginalized in our rural sections. And our hopefulness has got to get us there. Now, I wish I could stop here. I got one more, though. It's not just getting proximate. It's not just changing narratives. It's not just being hopeful. The fourth thing that I believe we have to do, if we really want to create more justice, more opportunity, is that we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things. And I hate saying that, because it's hard to do uncomfortable things. But what First State does is do the uncomfortable. What Brother Ronald does is he does the uncomfortable. He embraces the things that so many of us run away from. He goes into the places that so many of us don't want to go. They go into spaces where some of us have avoided. And it's that uncomfortable thing that is necessary if we're going to make a difference. Now, I know it's hard. As human beings, we are programmed to seek what's comfortable. That's just human nature. And I'm not here arguing against comfort. I like comfort. That's not what this is about. I gave a talk down in Mississippi. The people met me at the airport. They said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of person you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I said, no, what's wrong with you? Of course I do. She said, oh, no, we got the farmer to put you up at the barn. I said, what are you talking about? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is sometimes you have to position yourself in difficult places and be a witness. There is a different metric system for those of us who want to do justice. If we want to help the poor, if we want to lift up the vulnerable, if we want to create more opportunity and fairness, we've got to measure ourselves differently. We can't look at how wealthy we are. We can't look at our income. We can't look at our status. We can't look at any of those other metrics. There's something else we have to measure. I'll tell you this story. It was taught to me by an older man. I was giving a talk in a church. And this older man came into the church. It was an older black man. He was sitting in a wheelchair, and he got into the back of the church, and he stopped, and he just stared at me the whole time I was talking. He had this very stern, almost angry look on his face. I couldn't figure out why he was staring at me so hard, and it was actually distracting me a little. I couldn't figure out what was happening. I got through the talk, and people came up. They were very nice and appropriate, but that man kept sitting in the back staring at me. And finally, when everybody else left, this older man got a young kid to wheel him up to me in the front of the church. He came down the center aisle, and there's this very stern look on his face, this almost angry look on his face. And he came up the middle of that aisle, and he got in front of me. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up, and he said, do you know what you're doing? And I just stood there. And he asked me again, he said, do you know what you're doing? And I stepped back, and I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me one last time. He said, do you know what you're doing? And that's when this older man looked at me. He says, I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And this older man looked at me and he says, you're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice. And I will tell you, I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know. Then he grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, come here, come here, come here. I'm going to show you something. And this older man turned his head. He said, you see the scar I have behind my right ear? He said, I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama in 1963, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck? He said, I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this dark spot? He said, that's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote. He said, I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, people look at me They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars. He said, but I'm going to tell you something. He said, these aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars. He said, these are my medals of honor. We are in this room. We are in this room because there have always been people in this state fighting to create more justice, fighting to end poverty, fighting to eliminate racial bias, fighting to create services for the mentally ill, fighting to provide housing for everyone, fighting to feed everybody. For generations they have been here. And we can honor them and the best parts of this state if we join them in that fight, if we get proximate, if we change some of these narratives, if we stay hopeful, and yes, if we do some uncomfortable things. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I do. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And you can't get to what's the appropriate punishment. You can't get to a good solution until you know the other things that they are. I am persuaded of something. When I grew up in Sussex County, my little community, poor community, on the Sand Hill Road between Georgetown and Milton, we were like our own little world. We couldn't go to certain parts, we couldn't be in certain spaces, but it was a community, and I'm persuaded that the problem in that community was not the kind of poverty that we think about. I don't believe, actually, that in Sussex County and in the state of Delaware that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I really don't. Delaware is a wealthy state, it is. And I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit ourselves to more justice, that's when we begin to really eradicate poverty. We create opportunities that we cannot create otherwise. And finally, I believe that every time I come home to Delaware, I'm amazed at the growth, at the progress, all the things that I see. But I'll tell you something, I can't judge how we're doing in this state by looking at the new developments, looking at the housing, looking at all the progress, looking at all the ways in which the state is progressing in some of the metrics that the world looks at. I have to look at how we're doing in this state. I have to judge how we're doing, our character, our commitment, not by how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. I have to judge how we're doing in this state by how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the marginalized. That's the message. And we are doing well, but we can do better. And that's what excites me about the work of First State. It's what excites me every time I come home and I see the people who are working so hard in this state to create more hope. I am persuaded that there is both challenge and opportunity. And I'm really grateful to be in this space with you. There are times when I've wondered, I really wondered, what I was learning as a kid growing up. I'd go to church, my dad would take me to church and they'd read that scripture. And they'd say, Jesus said the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And it always confused me, but now I understand because I've stood with condemned people who were wrongly convicted and seen them freed. I used to hear those speeches by Dr. King, and I'd hear him say the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I never really got it until I stood with the poor and saw them move forward. I used to read that literature in Russian. In college, Russian literature, Dostoevsky would say, truth crushed to earth shall rise again. I didn't quite get it until I saw the poor and the neglected lifted up by people like the people in this room. And because of that, I am excited, I am honored, and I am thrilled that you are standing with First State. I want to thank you for that and wish you all the very, very best. God bless you.
What a treasure we have in Delaware from Sussex County, now from the world, because everyone knows Bryan. Bryan, your words were just so inspiring, and hope is eternal, I think, and we at First State understand that completely every day. Your sister said you got a lot of awards, but we want to give you one more from First State. Maybe you can find a place for it, absolutely. And your sister thanked our music folks, but I want to thank them too because it really does add to the whole ambiance, I love that word, of the evening, so thank you very much. Would someone who has all the 50-50 chances, bring them up so we can make a drawing? And we just had someone pop in here, and I think we can ask him to do the drawing for the 50-50. We had him on video earlier, but now he's here. So, Senator Carper, would you do the honor of picking the 50-50 winner tonight? No, you will not?
The winner is Leo Strine. It could be. Are you ready? 9, 7, 6, 2, 8, 9. I can't make out the last number. I think it might be 7. Last three numbers, 8, 9, 7. We have a winner. Leo Strine. All right, 8, 9, 7. Going once.
A proud member of the Public Defender's Office.
Let's check this real carefully.
The senator is verifying that he actually has the number.
The
You
winner.
see that, Bryan, in too many other places, a U.S. senator verifying the winning 50-50 number.
Justice has been done.
Okay, if you bid on the silent auction, you can go back and check it, see if you won, and don't forget to pay. And there's still some books for sale, and Bryan will be over signing them briefly, right? You have a few minutes to do that. And with that, I just want to thank you all once again for helping us celebrate 50 years at First State, and we'll be back to work tomorrow. Have a safe trip home.
Straight out there.